We have a terrific panel for you this evening, centered on a new book by Peter Ginna, who's right here, titled What Editors Do, The Art, Craft, and Business of Book Editing. Although Politics and Prose hosts many hundreds of authors each year, it's not nearly as common for us to host the experts behind those authors, the editors, publishers, and agents whose efforts are essential to the birth and life of books. Peter himself, during his more than 3 decades in the publishing industry, has had a range of editing positions. He's worked with a small independent publishing firm and a venerable scholarly one, as well as with large commercial houses. Most of his time has been spent in trade publishing, most recently as publisher and editorial director at Bloomsbury Press, an imprint he founded. For his new book, Peter gathered essays from more than 24 contributors from across the publishing field and wrote one piece himself. The articles take readers through every phase of book production, from acquisition to the editing process, to publication and marketing. Later chapters provide case studies and a look at pursuing a career in publishing. The book comes at a time of significant and fast-paced change in the publishing business. The rise of Amazon, the advent of ebooks, and the growth of self-publishing opportunities all have contributed to shaking up the industry more in the past 15 years, as Peter notes in his preface, than in the previous 50 years. Joining Peter on the panel this evening are 2 other veteran publishing insiders who contributed pieces to What Editors Do. One is Cal Morgan on the end there, who after spending many years at a very big house, HarperCollins, recently joined the small, very fine house of Riverhead as executive editor. Among the successful authors championed by Cal during his career are Roxane Gay, Jess Walter, Amelia Gray, Jamie Quattro, and Mitchell S. Jackson, just to name a few. His chapter in What Editors Do is called Start Spreading the News, about the editor as evangelist. Seated next to him is Susan Ferber, an executive editor at Oxford University Press. She's focused much of her editing career on books about history, from the ancient to the modern. Among the books and authors she's shepherded are winners of the Pulitzer and Bancroft Prizes, as well as New York Times bestsellers. Her chapter in What Editors Do, titled Of Monographs and Magnum Opuses, is about editing works of scholarship. And speaking of university presses, I should note that What Editors Do is itself published by the University of Chicago's. Now, also joining the discussion this evening and filling out the panel will be Gail Ross, founder and president of the Ross-Yoon Literary Agency, and a friend of Lissa's and mine. People interested in getting a book published often ask how best to go about it. Well, in general, the answer is to find an agent. And Gail, who specializes in nonfiction, is as good as they come. And also, to provide a little truth in advertising, Gail is Lissa's agent for a book that Lissa's currently writing. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our very accomplished panelists.
Thank you, Brad. It's a thrill for me to be presenting at this store, because Politics and Prose has always been a great supporter of the kind of books that I love to publish and to read, and many authors of mine have had terrific events here. So it's a kick for me to be the person up front instead of the one standing in the back. So thank you for hosting this panel, and also thanks to Gail, Susan, and Cal for taking the time and taking the train, in the case of the New Yorkers, to be here. So we're talking about this book called What Editors Do. It seems like a straightforward, not to say obvious, title, but one reason I chose it is because I think most people don't understand just what we do as editors. It's our own fault. for a business that's all about words, we have some of the most confusing and ambiguous terminology of any industry that I know. An editor would be Exhibit A. When you hear the word editing, you think about a person sitting, making notes on a manuscript, correcting grammar, or maybe making a note for the author, make this chapter shorter, swap these points around. But that's only a small slice of the pie of what an editor actually does. I've come to think of the editor's role in the most fundamental way as being a connector. You're the person who makes and facilitates the connection between writer and reader. An old saying in publishing is the editor represents the author to the house and the house to the author. And that sort of Janus-faced role is definitely a big piece of the editor's responsibility. But you also are you're representing the reader to the author. You are trying to be that ideal ultimate reader and helping the author create the book and shape the book in the way that gets across most effectively to that person. That involves both working on the author's text, the way I was just describing, but also the much broader task of bringing the reader to the book to figure out who those ideal readers are for this particular work and how you get them to read it, to want to read it in the first place. So I see the editor's job as breaking down into three phases that Brad mentioned in his introduction. They all overlap and some take place simultaneously. The first one is acquisition, finding books to publish. In many ways, that's the most critical part of the job, because if you don't find books to publish, you can't do any of the other things. There's no publishing house. Second is what I call text development. It's that classical editing function, again, where you're making notes and shaping the actual words, the actual writing with the author. And finally, there's publication, that part of bringing the book out into the marketplace, making readers aware of it, convincing people that this is a book that they need to buy. So I've asked each of our panelists to focus on one of these aspects of editing. Gail, as an agent, has a critical role to play in the acquisition process, so she's going to talk about what that looks like from her side. Susan has written a terrific chapter in the book about working with scholarly authors, and she's helped many academic writers do their first books for a general audience, which involves often a kind of intensive editorial intervention. And so she can talk about that editing piece. And Cal, who has my favorite chapter title in the book, which Brad also mentioned, Start Spreading the News, about the editor's role of conveying his passion about the book out to people, his colleagues in the publishing house, and then out into the media and to the booksellers and to the world at large. So he'll talk about that piece last. So Gail, we're going to turn it over to you. Tell us what agents think about what editors do.
We love you guys.
Say that into the mic.
Oh, sorry. We love you guys. You know, one of the books I worked on when I first started in the business was by a woman who had a testing device that was far simpler than Myers-Briggs. It only had 4 kinds of personalities. And she said to me, after going around and talking to editors in New York, that the myriad of things that you do bring together the 2 least complementary parts of her personality test, and that it was impossible to do what you have to do. So here's to you all. I want to say that this is a fantastic book. In fact, I've read this book and learned lots of things about the process I didn't know, and I'm buying a case and giving it out to each of my new clients because it answers all those questions and I won't have to answer them anymore. But in terms of what we do, we have to really know the individual editors. I probably work on a regular basis or a semi-regular basis and interact with maybe 100 different people in publishing, 100 different editors, lots more marketing and such. And that requires, I mean, I think the three most important things to me are smarts, or talent, passion, and responsiveness. And those are probably the things that my client would have said don't work for the same people, because it's hard to sit in a room and edit and also go out to lunch and make a big deal. Those are not complementary things. And so what I find is the greatest thing for me is I get to just talk, I get to know all these people and know their, you know, if I'm selling a book about depression, I know every depressed editor in New York, so I know who to sell it to. If I'm selling a feminist book, I know their kids' names, I know where their kids are going to school. So if I'm doing a book that's the inside story of, or a book on summer camps, I know whose kids having a problem at summer camp. And that's it, that passion. Most of the people that I deal with, I've already made decisions about smarts and responsiveness by working with people. But the passion stuff, they got to fall in love with this. This is your, I always say that I'm the midwife of a project, but this is the next closest person in my author's life. And we need a partnership because they are that connector. They are everything at the house to my client, and they're only going to make they only do the things that I can't do. And that's what I need them to make my client better than my client even is, right? And to fall in love and have passion and have knowledge and have experience and just care and be their advocate all the way through. And so that's the most fun part, coming off that list of people who are the right editors for particular projects is really, and frankly, it's hard to start out in this business and not know all those things. So I always tell people who call me and say, how can I become an agent, is to work for other agents, because those relationships are really, really crucial. And because it's hard, it's not that they don't want to publish books, but they have to go through so many hoops to sell in this marketplace today that you need somebody who's going to fight as hard as I am and fight as hard as an author is for their work, because it's tough out there, and it's the best thing in the world when it works. And even when it doesn't work really big, when you know that you've been in a partnership and that editor has made your work that much better and worked their hardest to make the house, all the different parts of the house that we'll be talking about, better. And they have to do that to make that acquisition to start with. They have to really love it and learn to love it as much as you do. So that's a little bit, and we'll answer questions later. But let me just
ask you one question now, because you talked about the number of hoops that have to be jumped through in acquisitions. I think a lot of people don't understand how complicated and how Byzantine the acquisition process can be in a big publishing house. Talk for just a minute about what that's like from your side.
Well, I'll work for a long time on a proposal to make it the best it can possibly be. And my intent with working on a proposal with an author is to answer an editor and sales force and marketing people's questions before they have them, to anticipate what the problems are going to be and try to best prepare in the proposal and in any kind of meetings that we have with authors and editors and publishers to have those answers already figured out for you. I mean, my job is to make you as the acquirer's job easier, right? To give you all the ammunition you need in the proposal and with the author to make it as simple. But it is hard. In some places, you take a proposal and you walk into your boss and the boss says, buy it. In most places, you go through editorial meetings. Sometimes the meetings are very editorial driven, and if the editors and the publisher loves it, you buy it. In other places, you have to hear from sales and marketing, and the editorial meetings, some of them are legendary, and they're 100 people at a table, and you have to go. And then you have to go back to an acquisitions meeting after the editorial meeting. So it can be Byzantine, but when they want it, it can be pretty fast.
Right. All right, let's ask Susan about the actual editing piece of the process.
Thank you. Well, I guess I first wanted to say that for anybody in the publishing world, Politics and Prose is like Disney World, the Super Bowl, Mecca, and Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory all wrapped up in one store. So, and we know how hard it is to get these seats because we try to get them for our authors. So I'm especially grateful and feel like I won the golden ticket tonight already just being here. And thank you all for coming. This is terrific turnout. My chapter in the book is about editing scholarly writing, which for me means actually hardcore pencil and paper. I just had many hours of transportation where I could just sit in my own little world just editing, and that makes me very happy. I work with a lot of first-time authors, but I also work with a lot of authors who've lost track of how many things they've published. Every single project that I work on really requires its own diagnosis for what work needs to be done, what work ideally could be done, and what the optimal outcome is for the author and the press. So I'm going to hone in, as requested tonight, on working with serious academics who want to write for a general audience. And in the field that I work in, which is history, there are a lot of them. There aren't enough shelves in the store for the number of historians who want to write crossover books or trade books or anything but the dreaded M word, the monograph. But what does this actually mean, and what does it require in terms of an editor's intervention? It's a different kind of challenge than editing a non-academic. At its core, the book still needs to make an intervention in the field, to make an argument that speaks to key debates in the discipline, or better yet, shakes up a long-held belief, and to do anything to move the needle in terms of a conversation that's been happening in academia for a long time. But in doing so, for a general audience, the author needs to wear his or her learning lightly, and to summarize the key ideas and how his or her own perspective alters that picture. This is not the place for offering the great intellect's ideas on this topic and putting someone else's words first, which is the first thing that I normally encounter when I see a lot of academics trying to do this kind of writing. This is where scholars often go wrong. There's over-reliance on secondary sources and on theoretical ideas or indecipherable sentences quoted completely out of context. Or completely erasing the landscape of everything that's been written before so that this work appears to be the first or the only one ever written on the subject. So there are things that go one direction or the other. Finding the right balance is really key to the work not being perceived as light or popular by a scholar's peers, and yet also reading readers beyond the specialists. Much of the time, for me, there are projects that I see, and there's a kernel of a crossover book idea in what I'm seeing, but I end up working with the authors quite hard to develop the ideas and the structure, and usually without an agent doing the work before I get to see it. It's a much more organic process, often like this weekend of going to a conference and for 4 days listening to people talk about their ideas, and then working with them afterwards, after it's something that I've decided that I think I really like, on turning points and key figures in the story. They may be human, they may be animal, they may be the landscape, on things like pacing and color and context, things that trade authors, I think, often get much more easily than academics. If I'm lucky, what I get to review already has all these elements, but most of the time that's not the case. It's a real rarity for me to work on a book like the ones in the Oxford History of the United States series with an author like Richard White or Gordon Wood. They already have publishing platforms, quite extensive ones, and followers, and they already know that they're writing for trade audiences how to do it. Instead, it's more likely that I'll see a project like Collie Gross's Hannah Mary Tabbs in The Disembodied Torso, or Virginia Anderson's The Martyr and the Traitor, or Rosalind Rosenberg's Jane Crow. I swear, I don't only edit women or American history. So let me just mention a couple of others that I'm sure are here in the store. Jeffrey Stewart's The New Negro that's just coming out, Roy Crabe's The Cry of the Renegade, and Elizabeth McGuire's Red at Heart. These are not the authors that come to mind when you think American history or world history. They're not David McCullough. And we work through these books quite a number of times. I know a lot of people think that academic editors don't take the time to do that, but there are a number of us who do, and it's not always a single straightforward edit, but really working over these texts to think about the introductions and to try to craft a book that will really bring readers in, and that will allow extensively researched, deeply researched books and projects to a larger audience. It means respecting a reader's intelligence, but not papering over ideas with jargon, showing and not telling as much about a place, a person, motivations, political and cultural climates as possible. I'm sure I'm down to almost my last seconds here. It means figuring out how long a book is that's ideal for the approach of what it is, be it a definitive biography, an event book, a big idea book, a synthesis, or a gigantic narrative history. No one has more time now to sit and read than they did in the past and to truly concentrate on the book, so we have to find works that are right-sized or make them that way. It's easy for readers and reviewers to turn to the names they already know and love, so a scholar writing a trade book needs to be extra good and to be, like me, lucky enough to win the golden ticket to find true trade success.
I think that's both a really good description of the kind of work that Susan does typically with historians, but that process of finding the balance between your expertise and the ignorance of a lay reader is something that anyone who's an expert it may be true of a journalist or a scientist or a think tank person. I'm sure many of you in this room are in one of those categories. So what Susan has to say, and I recommend her chapter highly, is quite applicable to things outside of academics or history. Cal, how about telling us about the editor as evangelist?
Sure. I first want to say we've all paid tribute to a little something at the beginning of our remarks here, and my version of that is that I wouldn't be sitting in this chair if it weren't for the guy who's sitting 3 chairs over. It was Peter who was the first person ever to hire me into a publishing job, and I was thinking this morning of the fact that sometime after he did that, I was hired to be his assistant, the assistant to the guy who ran the company that we were both working for. And a short time later, I came across my resume on Peter's desk, which was still kicking around, and it read on top of it, Specs, which is how he remembered which guy I was. I was the guy who was wearing specs, which I guess is the impression that I made. The spec-wearing young graduate right out of school who came and sat down in Peter's office really came to that room to talk about doing the job that Susan, you just talked about, to talk about being an on-the-page editor, and to see whether it was possible to realize the kind of great dream of a 20-something-year-old kid to spend all day long working with words and working with authors and filling more and more rooms that looked like my bedroom or this room or what have you, just full of books that with luck somebody would read. The great joy of my first year or two in the company where we both worked, which was St. Martin's Press at the time, was that it was a place where as a young editor you could begin to do that very quickly. One of the things, if any of you do, and I hope many of you will, buy the book and spend some time skimming through it, Peter's book, is how many skimming... No, before you even
Memorizing.
Listen, once they've bought it, that's
Right. Do what you want.
right. But one of the things you will find right away is how many people in the book who are in many cases in sort of prominent positions in publishing started out at St. Martin's Press, and the reason for that was that it was a place where young editors could begin to acquire books very quickly, without a lot of rhyme or reason necessarily sometimes, but based purely on their passion for the books and based purely on a small bet that they wanted to take, that there may be an audience out there for this first novel or for this book on a small niche subject, etc. And so I was able fairly quickly to start doing that. And I had a little bit of a sobering second shoe drop about a year after I bought my first couple of books, which is that, I did all of the stuff that we've talked about. I nurtured the authors. I worked with the manuscripts. I felt enormously proud that these books were doing the thing I wanted them to do. And so, well, great, my work is done, and I will carry on and now hand these books off to marketing departments and publicity departments and sales departments and go back to my proper work, which is commas. And then nothing happened. And I thought, well, what is the piece of this process that I've missed? What have I done or failed to do to ignite the marketing and publicity and sales machine behind these books in a way that meant that they were suddenly the talk of the town in Washington or New York or what have you, that they were getting out there and having a successful publication? And so I went and I talked to the guy I referred to earlier. His name was Tom McCormick, who was the CEO and the editorial director of St. Martin's Press at that time, and who Peter and I were both, in a sense, mentored by. And Tom looked at me from the other end of a very long cigar that he used as a bit of an argumentative tool and weapon, and which he was still allowed to smoke in the office at that time, in large part because he ran the whole company, so he could do what he wanted in his office. And he looked at me and he said, well, you've just learned the secret of publishing, which is that an editor is not just an editor. An editor has to be the associate publisher of all of his books. He probably said his, even though half of his editors were women. He probably said his. And I said, well, that sounds great. Am I getting a raise? Well, that sounds like a whole new job title. He said, no, it means you have a set of responsibilities you've completely neglected that you now have to begin to learn. Those responsibilities are the secret key to launching authors. We, as editors, do acquire books. We bring them into the publishing house. We nurture them. We edit them. We work with the authors. But the thing that makes them connect when they do connect out in the world is a vision for how to reach the audience. And that is a spark that we ignite with the raw materials that the author brings in. We are the people who start that fire. And as I was thinking about the way to describe it in the book, the image that came to me was that the thing that happens to us when we discover a new project is a little bit like a religious conversion, which is hence the subtitle, the editor as evangelist. When we go home at night with a new manuscript, we read it, we fall in love with it. We then have to do a very strange, quick job of educating ourselves about what we loved about it, and then finding a way in very short words, probably shorter than I'm using right now because I'm sure I'm eating into the time, to describe to everybody else why it is a lovable book, why it's an important book, why it's an embraceable book, why it's a book that the publisher should get behind. And that becomes what is effectively the conversion narrative that the editor brings into the publisher to get the publisher to authorize them to acquire the book. And then that conversion narrative carries on through the rest of the process and becomes a sort of a script that the editor shares with the publicity, with the marketing, with the sales departments, so that they all see what that path looks like. They all learn how to fall in love with it in the same way that we do, so that when the book then finally lands on store shelves like these, it's packaged in the right way, it's being promoted in the right way, it's being written about on the back of the book the right way, so that when you folks walk in the door as consumers, you've already heard of the book, you see it in the right place in the stores, and you already know that you fall in love with it because that conversion narrative has reached you in a way. So that is a big unknown part of what we do. It is a part that, toward your point, is very, very difficult to reconcile sometimes with the bashful inward people that we are as editors. But it could not be more important to the success of our books and our authors.
Right. I think editors, a lot of us get into the business for introverted reasons, and then you have to go out and be pretty extroverted on behalf of your books once you're bringing them out into the world. Just one correction to what Brad said. I have a couple of chapters in this book, an introduction and a conclusion, and also a chapter about acquisitions. And the image that comes to my mind, and starts with my chapter, is there's a spark. When you read something as an editor and you feel a spark, it's something about, it might be the plot grips you, or it might be the author's way of writing grips you, or all of the above, or maybe it's a topic that you really are interested in and feel like this is going to be the book that tells that story. You feel that spark in yourself, and you know, like this is going to, you keep flipping the pages faster, and you come to the end of it, and you feel like this is it. This is one of the ones I'm going to go down the hall with. It's the beginning of that conversion narrative. I mean, you're going to say something about this. I'm sure you feel it.
Oh, absolutely. But the interesting thing is one of the things I didn't say before in the terms of how difficult it is to acquire. At the end of the day, if I'm selling a book and I have several publishers interested, several editors interested, several publishing houses giving them the money to make an offer, at the end of the day, my client always has a book deal. You guys lose your books at the end of what's called an auction, because my client can only pick one publishing house if there were multiple offers. And I sometimes walk away at the end of one of those things, and I think, how many hours did each of the other competitors spend going through all those hoops, falling in love with the material, because it takes that to get the kind of money, especially when you're in a competitive situation. And yet, those hours you have to go on to the next. I had people cry.
A surprising number of people in publishing, from my reading of Twitter, watched The Bachelor. And it may just be because there's something that we all feel that's, that lines up with that TV show.
It's passion, and it's energy, and that passion brings the energy to deal with all the other things that are not as much fun.
Right.
And one of the challenges is that passion is something that you can feel in that moment, and its sort of half-life can be sometimes just about as long as the auction. Right. But if you win the book, you better hope that passion has a long life thereafter, because you're going to live with that book for 1 year, 3 years more, as you're waiting
30 in my
30.
case.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I've had that too. Waiting a long time for the final draft to come in. But with luck, you're also going to live with that author over many books for many years. And we've all had cases of authors where you started with a small book because the spark had to do with the writer, or the something about their talent or something about their connection with the audience that you wanted to invest in. But maybe it's not the first book that gets you over the top, and you have to sort of live for year after year, book after book, watching them build and just hoping that passion that you have sustains in the rest of the company, so that you can keep building toward the part where they'll finally break through.
Right. I think we should open it up to some questions. If people have questions they want to answer, we can go on pontificating about publishing at the drop of a hat. But I'd be happy to take questions here. Yes. Yeah, please step up to the mic so that everybody can hear you.
Okay. Hi, thank you. That was lovely. So you talked at the beginning about how there's been a lot of quick change in the industry over the last 15 years because of ebooks and stuff, and that all seems like something that happened to publishing. And I was wondering what you guys all would like to see change as something more active, I guess, in the industry, something you want to change about it going forward.
Well, I would say, first of all, that I wouldn't necessarily say that those changes happened to publishing. Some of them did, and some publishers were resistant to the kinds of changes that we're talking about that have affected the industry so much. But publishers, I think, in a lot of ways, have sort of seized the opportunities. It took a while to figure out how to do it. It was a tricky thing, but publishers have they're now publicizing books on social media. They're using ebooks very effectively, I think, and we don't necessarily like the changes all the time. We're kind of traditional-minded folks in general, those of us who were editors, but I think what I would love to see is for the industry at large to really make more of an effort to bring people into reading, to improve, to make books as big a part of the culture as they used to be, and that's obviously challenging to do with all the other demands on people's attention.
I was going to follow on that, which is to say, this isn't something that publishing can do alone, but I think publishers have obviously a vested interest in helping people in society to spend time slowing down and thinking and concentrating. And it's never been, I think, more difficult to keep up with the news cycle and to try to just sort of keep pace with things. That doesn't lead to, long-term thinking, or to people really getting at the roots of what's going on now. And obviously as a history editor, I would feel much more about the long-term roots of things. But it does seem to me that, children will sit and read with print books for a long time, that they captivate them. And at some point, it's very easy to get, turned on by everything with like electronics and gadgets and lights, and not to be able to concentrate anymore. And so the thing that I would most love to see is publishing to enable culture to get back to thinking and sort of slow thinking.
Right. Other questions?
Oh, I wanted to say
Oh,
something.
yeah, please do.
I just wanted to say that I have a particular wish for the future, which is that every person who comes into an independent bookstore and listens to people like us and our authors talk doesn't go home and buy their books online, and they buy them in this store.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
And everybody across the country needs to take my pledge.
Absolutely. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Ron James, and I had the privilege of having Peter edit both of my books. And I was wondering, you've discussed about how editors work to persuade other members of the editorial team, the acquisition team. I wonder if you could talk about editors working sometimes to persuade authors to consider a different angle of a particular chapter or something like that during the writing and revising process.
I'll be happy to talk about that, but maybe one of you guys wants to step up to that one.
Sure, go for it.
I think a lot of times the sort of long-term reading of a manuscript, writing all over the pages, and then sending like an extensive editorial letter to accompany it is met by an author who is at first extremely excited to get feedback and then like has a sort of deepening gloom. And I feel like that maybe I'll cancel the book at that very moment. So I usually say put it away for a little while and come back to it, because a lot of times the weird chapter that doesn't really fit there's something that it came from, and maybe it's a better article, or possibly there's a different approach, and that there's a reason that somebody stuck to it. At the end of the day, my name is never on that book cover. The company name is on the side. If I'm lucky, I'm in the acknowledgments, but it is that author's book. And so sometimes it's a matter of saying and really showing why that book, I think, can be better as a result of sort of thinking through it in a different way, that it's not really reaching me the way that I thought it was going to, or it's not really having the impact that that author might have wanted, and what you mean to have happen here isn't really happening. So rather than sort of saying, God, this is awful, what were you thinking in this chapter, to really show how it can be better. That doesn't always mean that it changes, but it's much easier to do when the book's like 50,000 words over the contracted limit, so that I could say there's a really good reason why this chapter has to change, and there's no way we can get this down without this coming out. That's a very quick answer to that.
But I think that actually, Ron's question is it gets to something that's really important about the editing process, which is, and I think this is one of the reasons why I used the words art, craft, and business of book editing in the subtitle. And one of the things that is most part of the art of publishing, I think, of editing, is as an editor, you have to sort of align yourself with the author's sensibility. You have to sort of bring yourself into line and understand what is that author trying to do, or what is this book trying to be. And that saying, what is this book trying to be, is not always something that the author fully understands as he or she is writing it. And so when I've always found, the question I get asked sometimes at dinner parties when people find out I'm an editor is, do you have to really argue with authors to get them to make changes? And, authors get mad at you when you say you want to tell them to do something differently. I've almost never found that because my whole sort of effort as an editor is to say, here's what I think this book is trying to do, or what this chapter is trying to do, and it's not doing it. And here's the best way I can identify why that's not happening. And if you do this, I think it will achieve that better. And as if you're right, and the author sort of understands that you understand where he's going or where the manuscript is going, you typically will get them to buy into making those changes.
I couldn't have put it better. I was actually on my way down here working on an editorial letter, which I more or less finished up sitting in Union Station about 2 hours ago. And that one of the opening paragraphs of the letter makes the point that the editor has first to try to understand the book nearly as well as the author does, which is sort of an asymptotic thing. You're never quite going to get there, but you get close. And then at the same time, to replicate and honor the reactions of the reader who knows nothing about it at all other than a basic interest in the desire to be entertained or captivated or what have you. And being able to honor those authors' goals while also working, as you put it at the beginning, for the reader and ensuring the reader's sort of good, smooth, seamless experience it's one of those balance beam things that we do, and it's a core part of our job.
There's a quote that I came across some time ago from D.H. Lawrence. I don't even know what it's from, but it's probably a famous quote that I'm just ignorant about. But Lawrence said, "Never trust the teller, trust the tale." And that's a really important thing as an editor, I think, is you have to, sometimes might even be sort of personally out of sync with the author, but you have to trust the tale, what he's or she is writing, and if you can get that, then you can, I think, make the right kinds of edits. Other questions?
So I have a question. So you've spent, months or years nurturing this book, either as an editor or as an agent. Finally, it gets to the point of publication and release, and it lands in our laps as booksellers. And you've watched this now time and again. So is there anything you would wish that we would do differently with your babies when we get them than we're doing? I mean, we obviously have an interest in promoting all the books that we get.
I'd like you to put all mine face out, please, in the front.
That was a softball question.
I'm going to throw that one to Cal.
I mean, I'll say that from an editor's perspective, one of the happiest and most surprising new things about the bookselling part of the chain, that's sort of that last link before it gets to the reader, in the past 10 years is that booksellers are now, because of social media and because there's a much, I think, bigger and more cultivated culture of readings and events and sort of author-centered long-term promotion. There is a conversation about books out there in the world that did not used to exist. And for us as editors, this is sort of the last little beat in my piece in the book, is about the fact that in the old days, even when we, learned to be associate publishers and taught the rest of the company how to fall in love with the book and publish it, the story would then sort of end when the book was out the door and it was in your hands now as booksellers. It is now the case that we're still in the conversation as editors, and the other part of the conversation is often with you folks. And there's a transparency there in the sense that there are literal conversations, but also in the sense that there's just more activity going on in support of authors, in support of books. There's not the old illusion that if a book didn't connect in the first 36 hours to 6 weeks that it was on sale, that a book was done. And I have been so impressed by the sort of new generation of indie booksellers that have learned from a store like this that has been doing it right for a long, long time, and is making bookstore culture is sort of an indispensable part of community culture, in the cities that are lucky enough to have really strong outward-looking stores.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm a book reader, and I spend about a third of my life in this bookstore. Luckily, I only live 2.5 blocks away, so it's easy. My question is about, I often run into books that I say, why in the world does this book exist? Who's going to read this? Who wrote it? And I wondered if you folks have the same phenomenon.
We think the same
what
thing.
the answer is.
All right.
I mean, the only thing that I can respond to that might be different than the other people on the panel with me is that I work for University Press, and we have a very important scholarly mission to disseminate information and to do that globally. And because OUP is so old, that's been happening for a few hundred years around the world, and that book doesn't happen unless it has an important mission or a piece of music or a journal or something that is distributed. It has to have that at its core, that it's not just about what stockholders will think will sell or what will be a commercially successful book. And so many of the most successful books in a critical sense that I work on sell very few copies to a very esoteric audience, and that's absolutely fine because they have that core, and that sits at the center of a mission, and that's very different than commercial houses for whom it's all about the money and many other things too. But the money really is a very critical part of the why the book is published.
I want to say a word sort of on behalf of Gail and her colleagues in the literary agent fraternity, because they do an important job for people like Cal and Susan and me in filtering out what gets to us. A lot of those, yeah. And what distinguishes a really good agent like Gail is when you get a proposal or a manuscript from her, she's not going to be wasting your time. It's not going to be a sort of a Me Too book or yet another book on a subject that's already been done. I mean, I think a very big problem, and this may be part of what you're talking about, a failing of publishers in general is they're sometimes kind of herd animals, and there is a habit of let's publish something that was of the kind of book that was successful before. I remember being in an editorial meeting. Actually, it was a marketing meeting when I worked at a big corporate publishing house back in the days when serial killer novels were a really big thing. That this was sort of the downside of the success of Thomas Harris and Silence of the Lambs, I think. And everybody had to have serial killer novels, and we had published many of them where I was. And one of the question came up, why wasn't this new book that was on the list, why hadn't it sold to the Literary Guild, which was back then an important book club? And our sub-rights director said, well, I talked to the editor at the Guild, and she said, we've already got 51 serial killer novels under contract, which made me think, like, 52 would have killed, you know. After 50, well, if we're going to stop at 50, why would you stop at 51? But that's, I mean, imagine the kind of glut of serial killer novels that there was at that time, and sort of some kind of book becomes successful. Maybe it's a surprising thing, and then every publisher wants to have something like that. I feel like I learned a really important thing I learned from working in academic publishing is sort of, and because in academic publishing, books have to go through a peer review process. Now, you can knock academic books for being too specialized or pedantic or whatever, but a book that's in Susan's publishing house doesn't get out into the world unless some people who really know about this subject have said, this person has something worthwhile to say about it. People in my field, whatever it's going to, American history or linguistics or population genetics, are going to want to know what this, are going to have to reckon with this book when it comes out. And I learned from working at OUP myself that the importance of really zeroing in on who needs to read this book, what person, identifying the reader. And it's in trade publishing, sometimes you say, wow, this is so well written, I couldn't put it down. And you have to go beyond that and ask the question of, like, well, who are you going to actually sell it to? What person, what's going to make people review it or talk about it? How will they get to know about it? And that's a really, really key question that good publishers and good editors ask, and the ones who don't ask it are putting out, I think, the books that you're talking about, the Why Is This Here?
Although I think that none of the major publishers are trying to buy or publish books that aren't going to sell. You know, when I started in this business, I mean, there were really three publishing lists. There's your front list books, and those are the books that publishers acquire to be bestsellers. And then there's mid-list books where they intentionally think it's going to only publish X number of copies, and they're happy. Maybe they're developing an author. And then there's backlist books, and those are the books that make all the publishers as much money as, those are the books that are in every store in America every day of the week, right, that they're automatically reordered. Whether they're your Shakespeare's or your books on Kill a Mockingbird, whatever, and certain dictionaries, travel books, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, and those books sell year after year after year with no all you're paying for is paper, printing, and binding. You're not paying for any publicity costs or any marketing costs. That's where publishers can really make money. But today, there are very few of those mid-list books published. There are lots of mid-list books that are not selling that well, but those were they thought they were going to be front-list books when they were acquired. And so no one's trying to publish that mid-list unless it's academic publishing or you're just trying to develop a first novel or something like that. But it used to be that you could sell a lot of books that would sell 5,000, 6,000 copies. Now that's a problem. So no one is really trying to publish bad books.
I had a friend who worked at a very big corporate publishing house in the 70s, and they brought in a big consulting firm to look at the business and decide what they should be doing better and differently. And the consultant came in and said, "You should only publish the bestsellers." Right. Question.
Hi, how are you guys doing?
Right.
Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Do publishers take manuscripts from the slush pile frequently, or not too frequently, in terms of like short story collections, or is that not the case anymore?
I think it really varies from house to house, and I think it still happens now and again. It probably doesn't happen nearly as often as it used to. When I got into publishing, and I was working at a very small literary house, I read the slush pile sort of religiously every week. Or I was the guy who opened all the mail, so that was the slush pile is what publishers call the literal stack of unsolicited submissions. People who just send things in addressed to, "Dear editor, please publish my short stories or my memoir," or whatever.
My fiction novel.
My fiction novel. That's always that's not getting. We're not getting past that line if you say publish my fiction novel. But I thought, I'm going to read the slush pile. We'd heard stories about things like Judith Guest being discovered in the slush pile and having a bestseller and a movie, and there were going to be sort of mute, inglorious Miltons that I would find in the slush pile, I imagined. And what I pretty rapidly learned is that the slush pile is full of slush. It's people who don't have more of a clue than to send their manuscript to Dear Editor, Oxford University Press, Dear Editor, HarperCollins, are not in general likely to have the other mental abilities that make you the good writer of a full-length book. It occasionally happens, but an author who wants to get published and doesn't have an agent should at least do the basic homework of reading the acknowledgments of the books that they like, or the books that they're trying to write one like, and see who the editor is, and then write to Dear Susan Ferber or Dear Cal Morgan and say, "I saw that you were the editor of Jess Walter, and I think that book is fabulous, and I'm not trying to write a book like Jess Walter, but I hope that the people who liked his book might be interested in mine for the following reasons." Then you're probably at least going to look at the first few pages of that person's letter.
I think the other thing to say about this is that the slush pile is, in a sense, a kind of an outdated idea. I mean, there was, years ago when I came into the business, a literal physical slush pile, because the way you would get your manuscript to the publisher is you would print it out and send it in. There are still slush email submissions, but the point I want to make is a little different, which is that the reason the thing that defined the slush pile in the past is it was authors, writers who did not have agents, and it was in a time when there were not many other ways to get noticed by a publisher. We are not in that time anymore, and the truth is there are a lot of writers, because where I work at Riverhead, and a thing that I've just found myself drawn to a lot in the past decade or so are emerging writers, first novelists, that kind of thing, or essayists. Somebody like Roxane Gay, who I published her book Bad Feminist because I had been following her for several years online. I didn't get interested in her because there was a very nicely packaged submission from an agent. I started reading her, and the hurdle for a young writer or an emerging writer to get published now and get one's work in front of editors like us is entirely different and much lower. And so the message I would want any emerging writer to hear is, we will read you if your material is out there and you find a way through social media or through friends who are associated with the business in some ways to get it to us. We'll read you. And it doesn't feel like in the way that the slush meeting used to, a charity project with a very, very slim needle in the haystack.
Right. I mean, nowadays, instead of a slush pile, we have Medium. We have blogs. We have people self-publishing their books, Wattpad. And you can sort of generate if you write really good stuff and have something to say, you'll get an audience. That's what will happen by word of mouth. It won't necessarily get you a publishing contract, but if people are responding to what you write, there are ways to put it out there without needing a person like Cal or me or even Gail to do it.
I just wanted to be contrarian for a second and say I still have a slush pile. It's a paper slush pile. I see submissions from, I don't really want to give a number, but it's a very large number, and the slush pile is higher than it should be for me to be reading right now. I've taken all kinds of projects out of that. Sometimes someone says, in the opening line that they've read a book of mine or that their advisor suggested that they write to me. I have award-winning books that have come out of there, and then there are people who are, coming up to me at conferences who are really, really pushy and are like in my face all the time. That doesn't mean their book's going to get taken. It's usually what I end up sort of picking up and being just surprised after going through, dozens of projects at a time and going, this one's really good. I like this. I don't really care what the letterhead says at all. In fact, it might not even have letterhead. This person might be an unemployed or underemployed academic, but this is just really good.
Right. Okay.
Hi, I was wondering if could you give some examples of how you've connected personally to manuscripts or subjects you have worked with, printed, like to print?
Well, I'll let other people go first, and
I mean, I could. The truth is, I could tell that story for almost every book that I've ever worked on. I mean, one of the nice things about starting out as an editor at a fairly general interest house like St. Martin's that had a broad range of kinds of projects you could do is that I was able to start out by looking for books on subjects that I grew up loving. I was a big film guy in high school and college, so some of the first books I worked on were biographies of film directors or musicians or that kind of thing. There were certain kinds of fiction that I liked, and then that meant that when a novel crossed my desk that had really lyrical writing or really adventurous punctuation even, I might be really interested in it. One of the first novels I published was a 500-page novel, literally with not a single comma, and it was effectively a 500-page suicide note in which, happily, at the end of the day, the guy decides not to kill himself. Nobody got there but me, by the way. But with every single book I came across, I would have that experience of realizing, oh my God, I can't stop thinking about this book. I can't stop talking to my friends about it. And those are the books you want to work on.
Right. That's the spark I was talking about. And you always try to take on books that have got where you feel some kind of a spark. I actually, when you asked that question, it popped into my head an experience I had where a book, and this happens to I think all of us at one time or another, where I started reading a manuscript that I didn't think I had any particular connection to. It was a sort of a memoir of an author who had spent time in Hawaii, a place I'd never been and never really thought about going at that time. And I read this manuscript, kind of memoir of going out from California, where she grew up, to Hawaii and falling in love with everything about the islands in Hawaii. And she conveyed that to me. I thought, wow, Hawaii, well, this is the coolest place. How did I not know about, And I was completely captivated by this book. It made me interested in a thing I didn't think I'd been interested in. Because it was so well written and conveyed her passion for the play so effectively. And I think those are the kind of really happy surprises that we all have in one way or another when you get something that that you're interested in film directors. Of course you're going to read the new biography of the new proposal for a book on John Ford or Buster Keaton or whatever. But when you get a thing that you kind of idly looking at it, and you suddenly go, wow, I never thought about this. That's kind of in some ways the most joyous experience you have as an acquiring editor.
I know we only have time for one more question. I just want to say briefly, because I started as a junior person in publishing, as an assistant, as many of us do, working our way up through the ranks, I inherited a lot of projects, and you never knew what somebody's real reason for not getting a book done was, although every note was some version of dog ate my homework note. And the most meaningful editorial experiences I've had are the books that I actually inherited that were not like stepchildren, but became like real children. And the authors whose every bit of their being ended up being a part of that book, to the point where those books were the things that would outlive them by decades, and I knew that. And seeing authors' projects through to their death, to the author's death, not the book's death, but to the author's death. Sometimes, no, not in the age of print on demand. We have no death of books anymore. Books could just get printed; they live forever. But knowing that author didn't want to leave this earth without the book done, that's really been the most meaningful author experiences to me.
It was mentioned earlier that the editor's name never appears on the book, and I'm just wondering if there are instances when you thought that it should. I mean, I'm wondering about the spectrum of how much writing an editor does. I remember, I don't know if it was Hemingway or some famous author, like 20 years ago, they found an edited version of something he'd written, and there was like a full page describing someone leaving a room, and it was just all crossed out, and the editor had written it, and he left. And do you ever feel like you're doing too much of the work, and how wide is that spectrum from just giving a few notes to doing major rewriting?
I mean, once you've sort of been at the business for a while, once you are sort of senior enough to have the luxury of having more choice in the projects that you acquire, you generally, at least I generally just don't take on books where I feel like I'm going to have to do this much intervention. When you're starting out, or sometimes you inherit a project from an editor who left the publishing house, that happened to me with the serial killer novel I mentioned before, which was just execrably written in every way, and nothing I could have done with the pencil would have saved it. But when you're starting out, you sometimes have to sort of take books that aren't as well written, and where you're going to have to make more of a contribution that way. But again, it's, as Susan said, it's the author's book. You're if you're really trying to rewrite the book yourself, you're doing it wrong.
And yet I still find that every instinct of starting a project, of thinking, I really like this. Oh yeah, but all these things need to change. So maybe I just, after 20 years, haven't gotten over that. But I always think it can be better. And when people say, what's a perfect manuscript? And I was like, I've never seen such a thing.
Right. I mean, I've definitely had the feeling sometimes it would be easier to rewrite this paragraph myself than to write two paragraphs to the author explaining how to do it. And I've often been in that situation.
And there are stories that are hair-raising, and we as editors hate hearing them, to the effect that an editor did exactly that and rewrote a paragraph in a book, and then the book gets reviewed, and the review says, oh, either this one paragraph was so embarrassing, or this paragraph was the greatest paragraph in the book.
Right.
And then the author calls and says, that is one of many reasons to be careful with your touch.
Right.
So yeah, just to wrap this up, and I'm going to sound like a complete novice, which I actually am, but having now seen this business from the vantage point of owning a bookstore with Brad, and now as an author who's had the luck and fun of working with Gail, I think one of the things that's really struck me, and also I do buy for one of the major publishing houses for this store, that struck me about this entire industry that I think is both kind of infuriating and perplexing on the one hand, and yet fabulous and wonderful and rare on the other, is that it's one of the few industries in which passion is really the metric. And they all alluded to that tonight. But from working on a proposal with a really great agent, and by the way, she kicked my butt for months until we got that proposal in shape that wasn't going to embarrass her and that was going to be good enough to be turned into a book, which is the more important point. And then you meet with the editors and publishers, and you realize these people, yeah, sure, they have to throw money around, but basically it's about a belief. in an idea or a belief in a story or a belief in something bigger. And that's just so rarely the metric in this day and age. And it's very, very refreshing that's the case. And then when you get into this end of it, the book selling end of it, we get dozens of books each week on our desk that publishers are sending us, editors are sending us advanced copies, and we can't possibly read all of them. And often they come with a little sort of robotic letter that says, "Dear bookseller, we think you should love this book because blah, blah, blah." But when I get a handwritten note or a personal note from an editor saying, "I really want you to read this book because of whatever," and I know that editor, I am going to pay very close attention to it. And so that's another gut instinct that happens. And then buying the books for the store, publishing houses have representatives who meet with various stores in various regions, and they will go through this little minuet with us about, well, you really should order 12 copies of this. Well, gee, really? Do you think it's going to sell that much? Maybe we should only order 4. Well, no, maybe you should order 24. And you go through this dance, but they have to win our trust, and we have to show them that we know what we're doing. And again, it's a gut instinct. And so much of it, what just ends up being a face-out book, what ends up being just stuck on a bookshelf. And so I just want to say, though, that I think one of the great, great things about this whole industry is the fact that passion is what drives it. The passion of the agent, the passion of the editors, the passion of the publishers, and hopefully the passion of the author and the readers. So anyway.
And the booksellers.
And the booksellers. Yeah, and the booksellers. No.
This book got reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement a couple of weeks ago, and I was very flattered to see it there. And this review from Britain sort of contrasted American, on the basis of this book, American editors with British editors, because we were so sober and businesslike. And I feel, and I made an emphasis in my writing in this book to say that editing has been sort of, it often is kind of romanticized or glamorized or sometimes demonized, but that I was going to try and explain, demystify it in this book. But I do think, and I hope it came through in the way people wrote, that we're only in this business because we actually love reading, just like the people who come to this bookstore. And there is something romantic about that, and it's still what keeps us coming back and doing this again and again, I think. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the questions.